Welcome to St. Malachy. I'm Father Joe Gembala, the pastor, and today I'm with our Director of Music, Mrs. Catherine Menzie, and Mr. Dylan Guzak, her assistant. We are very happy tonight to present to you a series on what we can learn about our faith and Scripture through liturgical music. Liturgical music has always been very important in the church. Many of the beautiful hymns that we sing were written by faithful Catholics who wanted in some way to express their deep love of the Lord Jesus Christ and what that meant in their lives. Tonight's first episode is going to be about grace. More specifically, is God's grace enough? And it's centered on the story of the patriarch Jacob. Now, there's a beautiful song in our contemporary songbook called Your Grace is Enough. And that song is really all about the life of the patriarch Jacob and what he can teach us about accepting God's grace and making sure that grace is enough for us.
Great is your faithfulness, O God of Jacob. You usual with the sinner's heart. You lead us by still waters into mercy, where nothing can keep us apart. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, O God. For your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. In the song of your salvation, and all your people sing along. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. For your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. God, I sing your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. For me.
That was beautiful. Thank you. The patriarch Jacob lived about 4,000 years ago in what is now modern-day Israel and Jordan, because he was across both areas at that time. He was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. Now, this is about 2,000 years before Christ, and it's a very different place than it is today. Back then, the country is very wild. There are lions and there are leopards, and in the Jordan River, there still were a few hippos back then. This was not a tamed land by any sense of the imagination. But there Jacob was, tending the flocks of his father Isaac and working with his brother Esau. Jacob was not an honest man. In fact, Jacob, from a young age, was known for his deception and his ability to lie. He deceived his brother, not once, but twice. He deceived his brother out of his heritage by selling it for a pot of stew that he had made. He knew Esau didn't understand these things, and yet he took advantage of him. And then, to acquire his father's blessing, well, he did something even worse. He disguised himself as his brother, and knowing that his father was practically blind, the deception worked. And his father ended up giving the blessing that should have gone to Esau as the firstborn. So Jacob, upon receiving the blessing, was told by his mother Rebekah, you better hightail it out of town because your brother's going to do you in. And his brother was very, very upset with him and probably would have done him in. So Jacob fled. And where did he go? Well, he went back to the country that Abraham had come from, around what's now the modern-day Euphrates and Tigris rivers. And there he visited his uncle Laban. Well, while he was with his uncle Laban, he realized that one of Laban's daughters was very beautiful. Her name was Rachel, and he fell in love with Rachel. And so he asked his uncle, what would it take for him to marry Rachel? And he said, work for me for 7 years, and I will let you have Rachel for your wife. Rachel had an older sister named Leah, and the tradition of the time was that the older sister had to be married first before the youngest. But Jacob didn't much care about that tradition. He wanted to marry Rachel, and so he worked very hard for Laban for 7 years. And then on the wedding night, after 3 days of feasting and drinking, they went into the tent. But when Jacob woke up the next morning, he realized it wasn't Rachel that was with him. It was Leah. He was furious. He came out and accused his uncle of deceiving him. And Laban said, well, in our tradition, the eldest must be married first. You can still marry Rachel, because back then men had many wives, but you have to work another 7 years. And so he married Rachel, but then worked another 7 years. During this time, Rachel and Leah and Jacob had many sons. They ended up having 12 sons. And those 12 sons represent the 12 tribes of Israel. All the 12 tribes of Israel were founded by those 12 sons. After many years together, Jacob decides maybe it's time to leave and wants to get paid. And Laban, reluctant to let him go, he's a very hard worker, and the flocks have prospered. But Jacob tricks his uncle. He says, I only wish to be paid by all the spotted sheep and goats, the blend of black and white. I only want those that are born over the next 6 years. And that I will take from my pay. So Laban takes all of the black and speckled sheep and goats and removes them from the herds and sends them miles away with some of his other sons. And Jacob is there with just all white sheep. But Jacob has a few tricks up his sleeves. He takes some certain trees that grew in the swampy area, certain poplars, and shaved off the wood and mixed it in the water to give to the sheep, knowing that this would cause a reaction inside the sheep so that every single kid goat and every single lamb born was spotted. This amazed, greatly angered Laban. But over the next 6 years, Jacob's flocks ended up being bigger than Laban's. Now Laban was not happy about this, and one time when Laban was away visiting his sons, Jacob thought this was a good time to hightail it out of the uncle's territory. So he gathered his servants and his sheep and his goats and his camels and his cattle, and they took off. Well, Laban eventually caught up with them, and they had a heated argument. But Laban was reluctant, but he agreed to let Jacob go. And now Jacob decided it's time to go home to reconcile with his brother. But he was afraid. He sent messengers ahead, and those messengers came back and said, your brother Esau's coming, but he doesn't look happy, and he's coming with 400 armed men. Well, the great trickster, the great liar, as Jacob has been named, has run out of tricks. He's grasping for straws. First he thinks, well, maybe I'll send a bribe. So he takes part of his cattle herd, and he divides into 3 groups with servants. And they all would go ahead, paced out about a couple miles in between. So that as they arrived and got to Esau would say, well, what is this? And say, we are servants of your brother Jacob. Here is a gift. And not 1, not 2, but 3 gifts would arrive within 3 hours. And maybe that would appease him. Well, the servants and the cattle left, but no message came back. Jacob's even more afraid. Now he decides, well, what am I going to do? I know. I'll take my wives and all my children, and I'll have them cross the Jabbok River, and I'll put them on the other side, and maybe when my brother sees my wife and all of his nephews, he'll soften his heart, and he'll accept them, and then eventually accept me. He goes back to the other side, and now he's all alone, out of tricks, out of any ideas on his own on how to get himself out of this mess. He had nowhere else to turn. And that night, an angel appears to him. And they probably had the most famous wrestling match in all of history. He wrestles with that angel until the dawn. And that match represents Jacob struggling with God. Is Jacob going to come to the realization that God did not put him on this earth to lie or to trick or even to figure it on his own what to do? But instead he was put on this earth to be a vessel of God's grace. So that morning as the sun came up, he held on tight to the angel and wouldn't let him go until the angel blessed him. And that blessing represented Jacob for the first time coming to the realization that in his life, God's grace was enough for him. When he came to that realization, the angel smiled and gave him a blessing from God, and then did something quite remarkable. To represent the change in Jacob's heart, he changed Jacob's name. He's no longer called Jacob after that. He's called Israel, because that's where Israel comes from. It's Jacob after he realizes that God's grace is enough for him.
For